Many people have been asking the question, could God be using the coronavirus as some sort of sign or plague to indicate that we are living in the end times? And so in this video, I want to discuss that, but I also want to give you what I believe are 7 signs that the Bible teaches that we might be living in the end times. That's coming up today on The Beat. Hey, my friend, welcome back to The Beat. My name is Parr. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you want a free ebook, click the link in the description box below. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing, hit that little bell notification so you won't miss a beat. Okay, so we are not the first people who have ever asked the question, are we living in the end times? As a matter of fact, Jesus' disciples had a similar question that they asked him in Matthew chapter 24. They were asking Jesus, hey, what are the signs that we need to look for that will indicate that you are going to be coming back? And so Jesus said, hey, these are the things that you need to look for. And I'm going to give you 7 of those. But before we get to those 7, I want to start off by reading verses 6 through 8 in Matthew chapter 24. And notice it says here, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Now, I want to focus in for just a moment on this word pestilences. Now, depending upon the version of the Bible that you're reading, you may or may not have that word in there. But it is this word that makes a lot of people question whether the coronavirus is some sort of pestilence, and that word simply means plague, that is indicating that Jesus just very well might be returning very quickly. But in order to answer that question, let's keep reading. It says, but all of this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. And so if you're a lady watching this and you've given birth to a child, you know that if you try to go to the hospital and get admitted because you're having birth pains, there's 2 things that they're going to be looking for. Number 1, they're going to ask you whether the pains or the contractions are being more experienced frequently, and also they're going to be looking for an increase in the intensity. So in other words, are these contractions happening on a more consistent basis, and is the pain of these contractions actually increasing as well? And I believe that Jesus is saying the same thing. He's saying, hey, there's always been wars. There's always been rumors of wars. There's always been earthquakes and famines and plagues and all sorts of things happening. But you will know that the end is near when you see these things happening with more frequency and also with greater intensity. Now, with that being said, here are 7 signs that Jesus gives us that we need to look out for that will indicate that we might be living in the end times. Sign number 1 is Christian persecution. Notice what Jesus says here. He says, then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. And we are indeed seeing an increase in this in certain parts of the world where our religious freedom is taken away, so much so that if you proclaim the name of Christ in certain areas of this world, you will be killed, you will be persecuted, you will be martyred for your faith. And Jesus said, this is one of the signs that you need to look out for in terms of, once again, remember, frequency and an increase in intensity that will let you know that the end is near. It may not be here, but it is near. But the second sign that Jesus says we need to look out for is not only Christian persecution, but also Christian opposition. I want you to notice what it says here. It says in verse 9, once again, you will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And we are seeing an increase in this as we speak. because of what Christianity believes and what we stand for, and the fact that we have a standard of absolute truth that goes against the grain of what our culture says, which is relative truth. People hate Christians because they don't want to be told what they can and cannot do. They don't want to be told that they're a bad person. They don't want to be told that they are a sinner. And everything that we stand for in terms of what's in the scriptures would go against what people naturally want to do in their human flesh. And as a result, we as Christians are experiencing an opposition almost like never before, possibly with the exception of what they experienced in the first century. But the third thing that Jesus says we need to look out for in terms of a sign of his return drawing near is apostasy. And that is just a fancy word that means people are leaving the faith. Notice that Jesus says here, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. Now, I want you to notice here that Jesus doesn't say they will lose their salvation, but it just says that we're going to see an increase in frequency and intensity, once again, birth pains, of people turning away from the faith. And we're seeing this, right? As we draw that line in the sand and people have to decide whether they're going to be a Christian or whether they're going to be of the world, we're seeing more and more people who may have grown up in a Christian home. And at one point they said that they believed in Jesus Christ, but now they are turning away from the faith. They're turning away from Christ. They're turning away from the things that they've learned as a child. And we're even seeing this in some prominent Christian figures like worship leaders from Hillsong or Josh Harris and some of these other people that at some point they were champions for Christ, but now they are turning away from the faith. And Jesus says you need to look for that, because as my return draws nearer, you're going to see an increase in that. But number 4, and this we see happening all sorts of, in so many ways in our culture today, is there's going to be an increase in false prophets. I want you to notice what it says here, and many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. And so once again, in our culture, we are seeing so many people, whether it's on TV or in churches, who claim to be prophets. They're taking the title of prophets and they are deceiving hundreds, thousands, millions of people by telling them something that God has never said, by promising them things that God has never promised. And we see the rise of certain organizations such as the New Apostolic Reformation or the Word of Faith movement. And these movements are so popular and they're permeating our culture because they are telling people what people want to hear. They're telling people that they will be rich. They're telling people that they will be healed. They're telling people that they will get out of debt and that God has promised them all of these things. And because of all of these things, they're leading many people astray. And Jesus said, these are the things that you need to look for that will indicate that my return is near. But not only that, the fifth thing that Jesus says that we need to look for in terms of a sign of his coming is that there is going to be an extreme moral decay or an increase in wickedness. Notice what it says here in verse 12. It says, sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. So Jesus says, whenever you start to see the world around you experience an extreme moral decay, then you will know that the end is near. And we are seeing this, my friends. We're seeing an increase in a record setting in terms of the numbers of abortions that we see in our world. We're seeing our society try to subtly push this agenda of same-sex marriages, and they're trying to normalize homosexuality so that your kids and my kids one day will grow up thinking that this grave, heinous sin is some sort of normal thing that just anybody does. We're starting to see an increase even in the Christian culture of divorces at a higher rate than ever before. Why? Because Jesus predicted all of this and said in the end times, people's love for one another will grow cold. But why will it grow cold? Paul also predicts and explains why the love for one another is going to grow cold. Notice that Paul said to Timothy, you should know this, Timothy, that in the last days there will be very difficult times. And then he says, for people will love only themselves and their money. He says, hey, we're going to live in a time where people are only going to be looking out for themselves. They're going to be loving themselves. It's all about me. It's all about my happiness. Happiness is the new God. And Jesus says, whenever we see people loving themselves more than loving others, and the love between others grows cold, these are signs of the end times. But it goes on. The sixth sign that will indicate that Jesus' return is near is that the Antichrist must be revealed. Notice what it says here in verse 15. It says, therefore, whenever you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now, if you know anything about the Antichrist, he has many names in scripture, one of which is the abomination of desolation. And so many people now are frantic and they're wondering whether the end is near. But Jesus says, listen, the end cannot come. I will not return until the Antichrist is revealed first. And Paul confirmed this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Notice he says here, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worship. Jesus said that I am not going to return until the Antichrist takes his stand and becomes a public evil political figure that is going to rule the world. Now, I got to be careful here because we're not talking about the rapture. We're talking about the return of Jesus Christ. That's a whole separate video. But notice what Jesus says that the Antichrist is going to do. It says here, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So I want you to notice here that in order for Jesus to return, the Antichrist, there's going to be something that happens that he is going to do to desecrate the very temple of God. Well, there's only one problem. The third Jewish temple does not exist yet. And so this leads me to the seventh and final sign of Jesus' return. And that is the rebuilding of the temple. And so all the things that I just talked about are mere birth pains, but the very first sign that Jesus' return is here is going to be the rebuilding of the temple. Whenever we start to see that happening in the Middle East, we know that the clock is ticking. Notice that Jesus says here, standing in the holy place, that's the temple, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jesus says, whenever you see the Antichrist desecrating the very temple of God, and if you happen to be still around at that time and you haven't experienced the rapture, he says, that is going to be the time's going to start ticking and my return is going to be near. But the problem is the very place where the temple is supposed to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, there is a Muslim mosque that is currently there called the Dome of the Rock. And so until that mosque is destroyed and torn down and a third Jewish temple is erected on that land, then the Antichrist isn't going to be able to desecrate that temple, which means Jesus' return is not yet here. It might be near, but it's not yet here. So is this coronavirus pandemic a sign that we are now in the last days, the very last days, and that Jesus' return is near? Well, I don't think we can necessarily say that with confidence, because if we look over our history, there's been many plagues and pestilences and flus that we've experienced, dating back to the early 1900s, the Spanish flu that took out almost 100 million people. We've seen the swine flu, we've seen Ebola, we've seen all sorts of other things. So until we see these things happening more frequently and with greater intensity, I don't think we can say that is clearly a sign that the end is here, but we can definitely point to these things and say that the end is near. So I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the coronavirus? Do you think that this is some plague that's indicating that the end of the time is here and God is using this possibly to discipline or punish us as a nation or as a world rather? Let me know in the comments section and let's talk about it below. If you found this video helpful in any way, feel free to share it with a friend. Also, if you haven't done so already, I would love it if you would subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time on The Beat.